Spring practice is just a few weeks away in Norman, talking Oklahoma football each and every week right here at the Voice of College Football. We invite all of you to jump in the live chat, leave those comments and questions for Jason and myself. Of course, we got Jason Ray here for edition number 103. Jason, under the weather, but he's going to give it a go here. He's a gamer. Jason, appreciate you being here.
No problem. Thanks for having me, as always.
Well, I got to say, when I was scanning the headlines and surfing around this morning looking for Oklahoma-related football news and saw that the coaching staff has received extensions and raises, the first thing that probably hit many, I would think, was the same thing that hit me. Didn't this team go 6-7 last year?
Yeah, no, and I and I think it's kind of typical, right? I mean, I think a lot of these schools continue to give these teams raises, or these coaches raises. I think the only difference here, Mark, is that with it being a first year for not only Venables but a lot of the staff there. I think that's part of it. Now, I mean, I think one of the guys that got the most significant raise as an assistant is one of the but it was built to his contract, and I assume that a lot of this is built into most of their contracts. But I think one of the guys that probably got the most heat, that got the most significant bump in pay, was Ted Roof on the defensive side. So, I think that obviously lends itself to, and I don't know how hard, Mark, that Oklahoma really looked at potentially getting someone else in for that defensive coordinator spot, and then moving him to more of an off field role. But obviously that never came to fruition. So you still have to think that Venables has a large part of that defensive playbook, calling the plays and things like that. But it'll be interesting to look and see how that goes moving forward this year, Mark. Because significant if there's not a significant amount of improvement in the defense, particularly the linebackers, that not only Venables coaches, but he's responsible for as well, then I think that'll be something that's a concern. Obviously, moving forward, year one you get a little bit of a pass, right? But I think year two, there's a lot more. Even at Oklahoma, there's a lot more expectations. Certainly day one, but certainly the expectations are there in year two. Now that you're starting to get some of your players in, you still don't have all of your players, right? But that really comes in year three and year four, particularly year four. But you're starting to get some of your players kind of trickling in here as sophomores and potentially true freshmen on the field this year. So that expectation is growing more and more, and I think that will be very, very critical for Oklahoma going into this season to see improvement, but obviously going into 2024 with the SEC.
OU fans, cut me a break here. I'm going to bring up a bad word for a second, but it sounds very similar to the situation at USC. Lincoln Riley, Alex Grinch, and they had a horrendous defensive year, and Alex Grinch has maintained his job. And I got to think that in both of these situations, that this is a make or break year for the defensive coordinator. To Jason's point, it's not like it's expected that OU is going to field a top defense this year. But if there's not significant improvement, you would think that Ted Roof's job as defensive coordinator, maybe not his role with the football program in total, but his role as defensive coordinator is very much on the line. And to be fair, I wouldn't mind a $50,000 raise. So that's significant to most, but at the same time, in light of his base salary of $1.15 million, it's about 4%, something in that range. So it's a pretty marginal raise. And he was not extended. He was not one of the coaches that had his contract extended. But my question for you, Jason, and I'm sure we discussed this at various points last season, was you have one of the great defensive minds in college football, Brent Venables, take over a program. He is not the defensive coordinator, nor does he have time to really flip the roster. But while there's a defensive coordinator there in Ted Roof, you would think that Venables would have a significant say in the defense. How much has he talked about his involvement in the defense and how much of a role that he's played in allowing Ted Roof to run the defense, but still being a mastermind himself on that side of the ball?
Yeah, he's been very coy on that specifically, Mark. I think, um, yeah, he's not really. I think a lot of people see the way the interactions happen on the sideline. You can tell, or you can make an assumption that Venables is calling a lot of the plays based on how he's interacting and how he's kind of communicating with everybody up in the booth, or what have you. But I think, yeah, obviously he wants, and I think the program wants everyone to believe and assume that, yeah, he's not the defensive coordinator. But I think we all understand that he's more of a, he's more involved in that, in the day to day, in the play calling, than a normal, head coach would be without actually having that title. When you look at Lincoln Riley, certainly he's the offensive coordinator. There's no bones about that. But I think this is similar to what Bob Stoops did when he first started at Oklahoma. So I think Venables is taking a little bit of that along with it, from a coaching perspective, because even though Venables and Mike Stoops were really kind of the co-defensive coordinators when Bob came on in '99, Bob had a lot of hands in the defense. So I think it's a little bit like that, but I think it's even to a greater degree now, Mark, that Venables is really involved in that, because I think he wants it to get, and obviously it was nowhere near what a lot of us thought it would be last year, particularly after how they started the first, few games of the year. But I think he feels like he wants this to be in a fairly solid state before he completely turns over the reins to someone else, whether, if it's Roof or whoever it might be down the road. Then I think that's when it'll kind of come, he'll pull those reins in, so to speak. But I think now he's got a much bigger hand in the defensive side of things than he would even admit.
And Sooner Thrawn makes a very reasonable point here. In a situation like this, when the head coach is so strong on one side of the football and has built a reputation as Brent Venables has, it is difficult to get a top flight defensive coordinator because they're going to be reluctant as to how much they're going to truly control the defense or have somebody of that caliber as the head coach on the defensive side looking over their shoulder, or even if there's that separation of responsibilities, that they still feel as though, this isn't my show.
Yeah, that's it's interesting, Mark. I think that point is very valid. I think it's going to be tough to get to exactly what he says, to bring a big name defensive coordinator, because they're going to want to run their system, and Brent has his system that he absolutely has, and to his credit, has been very successful with at Clemson, and certainly to a certain degree at Oklahoma as well previously. And so I think what's going to be interesting is, I know that there's been, a lot of talk about, like, grooming Hall to be that new defensive coordinator eventually, down the road, because he's done a really, really good job, or possibly Bates. But I think Brandon Hall is the guy that I continuously hear is a guy that's a really, really bright mind, has been with Venables quite some time. So if it gets to that point, Mark, where they think there's, a new guy that needs to be there outside of Roof, I would say Hall would be that guy. And I would think, as you continue to go through the tenure of Brent Venables, as long as this continues to be a successful stint for Venables here in Oklahoma, I think that's the mode that you would continue to see. is Venables kind of embracing his style with some of those assistants that they have and bringing those guys up, um, and having them be the defensive coordinator and title, unless he gets to a point, Mark, where he decides, oh, okay, I'm willing to sacrifice the thought that maybe the way that I'm running this defense isn't working the right way, and we bring someone in with a fresh perspective or a fresh mind. But I think at this point, it will continue to be Venables' defense until could be proven otherwise.
Appreciate you all being here at the Voice for College Football. We are here typically every Wednesday at 12:30 Eastern, 11:30, where it counts. But at the same time, we've got moving schedules all the time. So please subscribe, hit that bell for the notifications to know when we are going live, which has been basically 103 consecutive weeks with Jason. So we appreciate Jason. Jason hosts our Oklahoma post game for the past 2 seasons. And as Jason outlined for me before we started to record, that these extensions and raises to the coaching staff are a small part of the bigger picture of a facilities upgrade and a plan to really upgrade and compete in the SEC. So what do we know about that, Jason?
Yeah, so there was an announcement yesterday that $175 million, I guess, project is the right way to say it. That's going to go before the Board of Regents, and part of that was the raises that you had mentioned. And really, what this is it's a football operations facility. I think is exactly what they're talking about. So this is really kind of off the field amenities for the kids and for the program. So really specifically to like practice field stuff, like weight room, recovery room, things like that. And so Oklahoma had previously spent a decent amount of money getting it up to speed, but I don't think it's quite SEC up to speed. So that was something that Thad Turnipseed noticed initially when he moved over from Clemson to Oklahoma, and something that he talked about a lot last year, just in terms of getting that program where it needs to be, obviously with the looming move to the SEC, and obviously maybe a little bit sooner rather than later now, with that. So I think that's a formality. Typically, the way Oklahoma does that is they pay for these things themselves through through grants and donations and things like that. So I think from what I've heard, they're in the process of just kind of evaluating what that might look like and who might be able to do that work. But I think Oklahoma is going above and beyond in terms of the money that they're looking to allocate to this. There was, as this was announced yesterday, there was something floating around Twitter around the amount of money that Florida spent on this, and it was somewhere around the, I think as I looked around the 90 to 100 million. And you look at it, and it's state of the art, and it's outstanding. So the fact that Oklahoma is doing things like this shows obviously how serious they are in understanding where they're at related to from a facilities perspective as they go into the SEC next year, but also just the urgency that they need to get this done to compete. And really, what this is, it's a recruiting tool, right? It's stuff for these kids, that it's amenities for these kids that that they'll look at when they go on these visits. They look at the weight room, they look at the recovery room, they look at all of these different things that you have available for the kids, and that's part of that's the new shiny toy. That's part of what a lot of these kids are looking at. So I think it's really certainly timely, but I think it's something that will be certainly a big benefit from a recruiting perspective going forward for Oklahoma.
All right, folks, we invite your comments and questions there in the live chat. We'll be here for about another 45 talking OU football with all of you. Also, what caught my eye over the past few days, and certainly is connected to Oklahoma's entry into the SEC, is the scheduling format that's being discussed in the SEC. So we're at the point right now where, of course, going to a 16-team league at the SEC is heavily considering a 9-game schedule, although I have seen some pushback from particular schools that it's been rumored that certain schools in the SEC would like to hang on to that 8-game conference season. But at the same time, 9 looks like the way to go. And it's reasonable when you think about having a 16-team league. If you're only playing 8 conference games, then you are missing 7 teams in your conference. I don't know how well you can justify or validate a conference championship when you don't play 7 teams in the conference. So it looks like the format's going to be a 3-6-6 model where you play 3 permanent opponents each year, and then the rest of the league is divided into 2 groups of 6 each. And so Brian Kelly made a statement a few days ago, which on the surface seems to be a very tough statement. Like he's come to the SEC to play the best. It's the same statement that he made when he got the job at LSU. I want to play against the best. I'm here to play against the best. Made the same statement the other day regarding the schedule. Well, that sounds good, and that's the right thing to say. But when it comes down to it, Brian Kelly's going to play the schedule that's given to him regardless. So he might as well say, I'm here to play the best. We're not going to back down. We want to play Alabama every year because that's the schedule he's going to be handed each season anyway. So he might as well make those statements. Nick Saban, on the other hand, pushed back because he's been an advocate of a 9-game season in the SEC even before expansion, and came out the other day, with what I thought was a completely ludicrous statement, because he makes the comment that they've given us LSU, Tennessee, and Auburn, and I don't know how they came up with that decision. Well, I don't know that there's a school in the country that has as clearly defined 3 rivalries as Alabama does with Auburn. That's the Iron Bowl. We don't even need to discuss that. Tennessee, that game's been played for generations. Mid-October, it's an established national rivalry. And then the third game, yeah, LSU and Alabama may not be hardcore rivals to a certain extent, but they've been playing each other in the SEC for, again, generations. This series has been going on. And most specifically, as SEC Western Division foes since 1992. And beyond that, it's become one of the most highly anticipated and televised games in terms of TV ratings. It's always a top 3 to 4 matchup in college football each and every year. So I thought it was just kind of funny that Saban just throws up his hands like, I don't know where they came up with these opponents, where it seemed to be pretty obvious to me that those should be the 3 for Alabama, at least 2 of them for sure, but really all 3.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, I kind of, excuse me, I kind of chuckled at that a little bit myself when I saw Saban's comment. So yeah, and I think moving forward with that, I think it'll be, it's obvious, like, right. I mean, I think it's obvious to you and me and everyone that obviously follows the sport that that would naturally be, there are three games that they would have each and every season. So I think that's just Saban being Saban more than anything. Um, but I think it's, when you look at it from the Oklahoma perspective, it looked like, I think we were on the cuff. I think we were initially a little bit surprised that this would this is how it would be, because I thought most of us thought that it would be for Oklahoma's traditional teams. It was going to be Texas, probably Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, or Texas A&M. One of those. But when you looked at it, they got Florida in the mix, and I think part of that is that's a little interesting, in the fact that Oklahoma's never really had a rivalry with Florida, but there's some ties from Oklahoma to Florida over the years with with Bob Stoops, and Oklahoma's played them a couple of times recently. As recent as a couple of years ago in that bowl game where it was, Florida really didn't even put together great team with everybody opting out and things like that. So I think I think for Oklahoma it's good. Like it's a valuable game to have, from a recruiting perspective, more than anything. You get your footprint into that area a little bit. So I think that will be very, very interesting if those if those matchups do come to fruition the way that they had mentioned. But yeah, and I think the one thing that's still obviously up for interpretation is that 8 game conference schedule or 9 game conference schedule on how they're going to move forward with that. So yeah, I think people are happy. I think Oklahoma just I think the fans are excited about playing different teams. I mean, I think there's some out there, Mark, that I think, and you're gonna have these you're gonna have these fans in all fan bases, right? That are delusional. That but then you've got some realistic fans out there. And I think there's a lot of realistic fans out there, Mark, that are genuinely just excited to play the Alabamas, play the Floridas, play the LSUs, play those Auburns and things like that that are, obviously historical powers. But I think there's some that think that Oklahoma can just come in and dominate that conference early on, or at least, compete for championships each and every year. But I think there's a lot more realistic fans that are excited about the opportunity, but also understand that, hey, Oklahoma might take their lumps a little bit early on. So I think um, I think that will be interesting to see, and this is what makes this year just so critical. I think for Oklahoma is you don't want to follow a 6-7 season with another mediocre 6-7 or 6-6 7-5 type of season going into the SEC, because number one, like, and you know this as well as I do, but the fans are the fans and the people around. There's going to be so much pressure on the Venables if he has 2 subpar years in a row. The questions are going to come up. Is he the right guy for the job? If they throw out a 7-5 this year, and so that's the uncertainty that you just desperately don't want to have going into the SEC. And so this is as critical as a year as Oklahoma has had on the football field in a long time.
Yeah, and I know that you're addressing it for long-term concerns, and you should be as an Oklahoma guy, and everybody here watching and listening from an Oklahoma standpoint, looking down the road and preparing the team and the program for SEC. I'm more interested just to see the Big 12 race this year, because I just think that Texas has an opportunity. They have the ability and the talent to maybe run away from the field. But when has Texas ever done that? We're still waiting for them to pull through on that. So I have no confidence in Sark, and I have no confidence that they're going to actually do that. So what I'm expecting is like this complete free for all. You can almost throw out a team in the Big 12 this year, and I could make an argument for about 6 of them winning the conference. So I just think it's going to be a fun season from the standpoint of unpredictability within the Big 12. But you're right. What's much more important is preparing this program for a step up and competing in that league.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Mark. I, I I couldn't agree with you more. I think there's a lot of intrigue into this season. I know we'll have plenty of time to get through that, but you've got. I think at this point, most people feel like Texas is probably the odds-on favorite, at least in the early season. I mean, stop me when you've heard this before, but I think
They are really loaded on offense,
they
especially.
yeah, they are. So I think they are going to be the odds-on favorite. And you've got Kansas State that's up there. I know TCU's lost a lot, but I think there's still going to be a team. You get to the national championship game, and no matter how that worked out, you still have, in terms of how they played last year through the Big 12 itself. So I think um, you've got a lot of notoriety, and you've got a lot of respect that kind of built on that team. But you've got a few teams, and Oklahoma's one, Baylor's another, that is sort of kind of in the middle of the pack, so to speak, a little bit behind. And we'll see how, because both of those teams had a kind of, you would say, had a disappointing 2022 comparing where they were in the preseason and what those expectations were coming into the season. So I think yeah, I mean, if then you talk about the new kids on the block, so to speak, with with BYU, and BYU is probably the best positioned team, I would say, coming in out of Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF. But I think that will be interesting to go through. And I mean, and Oklahoma State's one of those teams as well. That's really that's interesting. They've just had a horrible recruiting class by their standards, and they've lost a lot of kids off last year's team, and including the quarterback. And so it'll be interesting to see what that looks like. And so yeah, no, I think I'm with you. I know that a lot of people are excited about 2024 with the SEC, but I'm excited what this new look Big 12 team could look like. Our Big 12 you know conference could look like this next year.
Yeah, look at all four of these newcomers, and I think there can be a case made for each one of them as being the most prepared to enter the league. I would agree with you that it's BYU right now, but over the past 10 years, Houston, UCF, and Cincinnati have all taken their turns as being the preeminent group of five program, and then BYU has been the most consistent historically over the last 40 to 45 years in being a top notch wherever you want to place them as an independent, a power five or a group of five. They're somewhere lost in between. But it's going to be obviously more challenging I've run through the numbers, and all four of those programs have basically competed at like a 500 level in terms of wins and losses against the power five in the last 10 or 15 years, but having to play those kind of opponents week after week after week may be a different story. So there might be a bit of a, just like TCU experienced, um, a year or two that it takes to acclimate, and they certainly, none of them are recruiting at the level that you would expect them to be able to compete if you just look at recruiting rankings. But then again, when has Kansas State ever brought in anything better than like a top 50 class? So they're able to pull it off. So coaching and development is going to be a big key in that. Weston is one of these fans right here that he's not concerned. He believes 2022 was a fluke. I don't know that it was a fluke.
No, I think one of the things that I've kind of heard. Obviously, this isn't something that's floating around, but I think there was, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, I think there was an element of surprise and shock about just how, and I don't want to say bad, but comparing Oklahoma standards on the defensive side of the ball where the talent was. So I don't know that Venables and the staff had a full grasp, and you probably wouldn't, but had a full grasp of how much of a struggle it was going to be, last year on the defensive side of the ball. And so now you've got that recruiting class, and then you've got last year's, and then you've got this year's recruiting class that was top five, and hopefully you got some guys that have been able to buy in to exactly what to exactly what they're looking to do, and be that much more successful. And the fact of the matter is, on the defensive side of the ball, this is one of the worst. I think you continue to say this like almost over and over every year, but I think statistically this past year was one of the worst defenses that Oklahoma has had in a long time. And I think all of us, it kind of came as a shock, because as we learned later that Nebraska was not a great football team last year. But I think after that Nebraska game to conclude the non-conference, a lot of us watching, and then a lot of people naturally thought, okay, this is going to be a lot better and a much improved defense, and it just wasn't. It continuously got worse, and there were some buy-in issues and things like that. So again, I think there was a little bit of both. I think there's some questions about buy-in, and then there's some talent there, and so it kind of remains to be seen on both sides of the ball. This roster isn't where it was when Riley was there. It's on both sides of the ball. There's some retooling and restocking that needs to happen for for this program to be successful. And I don't know I don't know how quick of a fix it'll be. They've brought some great kids in from the transfer portal that I think is going to help them immediately on the defensive side of the ball. And then they've got some young kids on the offensive side as well. So I think this could be has the opportunity to be a much better team in 2023 here, but how much better it kind of remains to be seen. This isn't a big, in my opinion, right now, looking at this roster, this is probably not a Big 12 championship caliber team, but it can be. I think it depends on if all of these if all of these kids really mesh and buy in, they have the opportunity to potentially be there. But there's got to be a lot of um, there's got to be a lot of improvement on both sides of the ball. And I think the one thing that you can take, Mark, as a little bit of a silver lining. And I can't remember off the top of my head if it was 4 games or 5 games, but there was either 4 or 5 losses that were by 1 possession or less. So you're 6-7 last year. You find a way to win. Let's just say 3 of those 4. Then you're looking at a an 8-4 or 9-3 type of season. So they need some things to go their way in certain situations as well.
I certainly disagree with most of this comment from Jim, who says Oklahoma has already changed the landscape of the SEC, making all games relevant rather than a few top games and then cupcakes. Now you get to play every 1 year in and year out, not every 10 years. So, what I'm interpreting there is that there are a lot of people out there that do believe that the SEC is a 2-team league, Alabama, Georgia. But I would say if you go to the numbers, take Alabama and Georgia out of the SEC, but also take the top 2 teams out of every other conference in America, the SEC is still going to be the best conference from 3 to the bottom of the conference versus all the other conferences. If you look at non-conference games against the other Power 4 conferences, and you look at bowl games and postseason games, the SEC is still going to be the best conference. So, Texas would not have fared very well in the SEC. Shoot, they barely had a 500 record in conference since they went to the BCS championship game in 09. I ran those numbers, and yeah, they're winning like 53% of their games in the conference. So
Yeah,
they would not have done anything in the SEC.
yeah, no, I'm with you, and I think it's sometimes just some to a certain degree, it's one of those things where sometimes you have to actually go through something to value exactly what it is, and I think and with this comment, and I think there's others that share this sentiment, whether it's Oklahoma fans or whether it's Texas fans or whether it's Big 12, just people in general. Remember the comment that Sonny Dykes had made about with TCU this past year in terms of they don't get to play. He made the comment, we don't get to play an FCS opponent or a lower tier FBS opponent late in the year. Yeah, but you also don't have to run the gamut of the SEC schedule. So I think this is one of those things for some. As I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of people think that Oklahoma and or Texas are going to be able to compete at a very, very high level initially, and they may, they may, but I think both schools to a certain degree, the I, I think just these games each and every week that are way more challenging. And I know Kansas was much improved, but throughout the years you've had a little bit of a doormat in Kansas, or previously you've had Iowa State, and a lot previously you've had Kansas State that wasn't. So I think throughout the years there's been teams where you could not necessarily be at your best and you can get away with that and win. I mean, in the SEC, I mean, there's really Vanderbilt, and that's about it, right? I mean, there's not teams that are taking last year away. Obviously, there's not a Kansas in the SEC outside of Vanderbilt. So I think when you look at it, when you stack it up, It's not really, no disrespect to the Big 12, but it's not really even close to in my estimation, in terms of exactly what these teams are going to go have to deal with week in and week out, um, as opposed to what they're seeing in the Big 12. So, and I think it's like one of those things that you have to, that some fans and some people that are closely following both of these programs will have to go through to understand. Yeah, it's a lot tougher than maybe I realized.
Yeah, I in no way would want to discredit what TCU accomplished last year, but if you watch them play from week to week against the Texas Techs of the world and Baylor, who turned out to be a 6-7 team that they had to pull out a miracle to win that game, and over and over, it's not hard to see where if you just plucked a mid-tier SEC team like Mississippi State or Ole Miss or Arkansas and had them play TCU in the middle of the season, wouldn't shock me if they would win that game. I'm
Yeah,
not saying that they're better, but that would not be much of an upset.
yeah, completely agree, Mark. And um, yeah, it's just, I mean, and a lot of people have noticed this, but I think the differences are, I mean, for a large majority, I mean, Oklahoma and Texas could probably compete at a skill position perspective with a lot of these, mid tier, what we're calling, exactly your point. Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Arkansas, those are perfect examples. Where the difference is, and I think Texas has seen this a couple of times, and quite frankly, Oklahoma's seen it a couple of times as well in some of these big games that they played, um, in the playoffs, where the difference is the offensive and defensive lines, the type of player that the SEC teams are getting compared to the type of player that traditionally that Oklahoma and Texas has been getting is very, very different. So I think I think as you continue to go through this and think through this, that's the thing that Oklahoma and Texas need to be able to get better on, get better in, is that recruiting and that development among the offensive and defensive lines, because that to me seems to be the big difference in the two conferences.
And again, Sooner Thrawn, here's the deal. All these games that you're citing are against SEC teams. So when you're talking about Tennessee getting steamrolled by South Carolina, yeah, that's who they get. That's another SEC team. So basically, here's the deal. If you take the SEC 1 through 14 and you match it up, it's proven every year. It's not been proven in any year in the last 15 years that based on out of conference results, both in the playoffs, the bowl games, the non conference games, that the SEC wins more than anybody else, and it's not close. Now you can take a particular bowl season, you can take little slices here and there, but my goodness, that league just this past season beat TCU, Ohio State, Kansas State, Oregon, Utah, Pitt, Clemson, BYU, my goodness, Illinois, uh, Purdue. There is nowhere close to that stack of a lineup of wins by any conference. It's not even close. Just isn't.
Yeah, no, I'm in complete agreement with you.
All right, Jason, anything from the NFL Combine? Not that you need to comment, but did anything stand out to you? I know Marvin Mims was there. He was pretty impressive, and some offensive linemen.
Yeah, I think the two major takeaways: one, really good, and the other one, unfortunate. As you mentioned, Marvin Mims ran. I think he got clocked at a 4.37. It is 40 or 4.37 or 4.39. So, really, really impressive as far as that goes, and that's something that will be good. Obviously, will serve him well as he continues to go through evaluation process. And I think for Wanye Morris, unfortunately, he looked like he popped a hamstring towards the end of his 40 time that he ran. And so he'll have some recuperation time to before his pro day at Oklahoma. So, and I know I kind of I kind of saw some things where it kind of sparked some questions and concerns in terms of the way offensive linemen run through these, because that's, I mean, obviously when you got running backs and wide receivers and even I guess quarterbacks to a certain degree, that's something that they need that top end speed. But from an offensive lineman, how often is an offensive lineman, running 40 yards down the field, right? So I think there was some thoughts around how valuable it is, and not just from an Oklahoma perspective, obviously, but just how valuable it is for for Oklahoma or for offensive linemen or defensive linemen to in that perspective to do this, to run this 40. And so I don't know if anything will come of that and in conversations, moving forward. But I think that was something interesting. One of the takeaways that I saw from that as well.
Sooner Thrawn. No, not saying that the SEC is not the best. I'm saying in the conference, only those two teams can say that they're going to win 90% of their 95% of the time. Well, that's a pretty huge statement, first and foremost, right there. Any schools across the country that are going to win 95% of their games, there's basically three of them. The others all beat each other. Well, see, that's the point. That's how good the league is. The other teams beat each other. The test is when they go outside the league, and they won those games. Mississippi State beat Illinois, and they beat Arizona, and Tennessee beat Pitt, and they beat Clemson, and South Carolina beat Clemson, and so they went out and beat their peers. Take out Georgia, take out Alabama. Those teams won like 70 or 80% of the games against their like-seeded teams in other conferences outside. And you can't take those two teams. If you're going to take those two teams out of the SEC, you got to take out the two best teams in every other conference.
Right.
You can't say, well, it's all Georgia, Alabama. Okay, we'll take out Ohio State and Michigan, take out kind of overall Oklahoma, Texas, or whichever teams it changes per year, Oklahoma and somebody out of the Big 12, and so on and so forth. All right. Well, Jason, appreciate you being here. Know that you're not feeling well, and certainly get healthy, get better. We want to see you here healthy next week.
Will do.
Do your best. All right, Jason, appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for being here again. We make it most of the time on Wednesday, but please subscribe and hit the bell for the notifications to know when we will bring our 104th edition here at OU Sooners Live.